Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2022. This is a BookTube event created by Vin at Revenant Reads with a ton of great co-hosts, and the event is designed to celebrate Star Trek fiction. We're going 2 months this year. We did August for the grand old Star Trek, directly inspired by Gene Roddenberry, and then September, which is called Book Trek: Strange New Worlds, and which deals with so-called New Trek or ex-canon Trek, anything that isn't directly part of the cast and crew and core of the old Roddenberry shows. But mostly, to me, it seemed natural to concentrate on so-called New Trek, which is this raft of new Star Trek shows that Disney has put out. That or is it Disney? Well, it's the studios put out a raft of new Star Trek shows under the so-called creative vision of Alex Kurtzman and Akiva Goldsman. Star Trek Discovery, for instance, the kid show Star Trek Prodigy, the cartoon Star Trek Lower Depths, the legacy show Star Trek Picard, and Star Trek Strange New Worlds, a new Trek show that was actually called Strange New Worlds, which is the adventures of Captain Pike, the captain of the Enterprise previous to Captain Kirk, who we meet in the original series as a paralytic his face is devastated, his body is totally immobile, he's in a mechanical chair that he controls with his thoughts, and he can't do anything. He's a wreck of a human being, and we're told in that episode with the only two-parter in the old Star Trek show, we're told that it was some sort of horrible radiation leak that put him in that chair, and that he ran in to save a bunch of cadets at the cost of his own health, crippling himself, and that's all that was left of him. That two-parter was made out of the original pilot for Star Trek, which was not going to star Captain Kirk. It was going to star Captain Pike, and his brash alien Lieutenant Spock, and his mysterious First Officer Number One, plus other cast members. You had his ship surgeon, Dr. Boyce. And that original pilot, once upon a time you could only see it at Star Trek conventions, but it was carved up and used very effectively in that two-part original series episode, in which Mr. Spock, who is now First Officer of the Enterprise under Captain Kirk, feels an unbreakable bond of loyalty with his previous captain and is willing to abduct him and bring him to a planet where the alien species that lives there can essentially free him from his paralysis, from his pain and wasted life, by giving him the mental illusion of being hale and healthy and young. Spock comes from a telepathic race. Maybe that gives him an extra impetus to think that this is a real solution. Christopher Pike's wasted body will still be on that planet. That is still reality. But he will be forever entwined in this illusion that is wonderful. And that's what Mr. Spock thinks that his old captain deserves. And that's all that we get of Captain Pike. It's not much. And so the showrunners and the writers of Strange New Worlds had a wide open canvas to play with in terms of Pike and his personal history and his relationship with Number One, or with Dr. Boyce, or with any of the other people on board the Enterprise under his command, and all of their adventures. We can assume that Captain Pike had as many adventures as Captain Kirk, and it's wide open territory. But giving modern 21st century Twitter-addicted showrunners wide open territory does not guarantee respect for the tiny bits of lore that are already there, for the tiny bits of continuity that other people have made. Doesn't guarantee that at all. And the first things that I noticed about the TV show Strange New Worlds were those deviations, the attacks that Alex Kurtzman made on settled Star Trek continuity. Like I mentioned, there's precious little settled Star Trek continuity when it comes to Captain Pike. We're not talking about Bruce Greenwood here as Captain Pike in the J.J. Abrams lens flare movies. That's an alternate reality. We're talking about in Roddenberry's settled continuity. There's very little that you need to respect. It's a tiny thing. You could fit it on an index card. You'd think that that would not be hard to do. So you can only conclude that if your showrunner violates those tiny bits of continuity, they're doing it intentionally, and of course they are. A big part of the modern culture war appropriation of old franchises, whether it's Mulan or Doctor Who or Star Trek, is to violate canon. It is to violate the creative efforts of the people who've come before you, even though it's those creative efforts that gave cachet to the very thing you're desecrating. If you are a showrunner for the BBC and you decide to make an incredibly woke show about a time-traveling alien, and you don't call it Doctor Who, it will tank in the ratings because no one will watch it. So you need that. You need the creative superstructure that other people have made. You need it in order to get to a place where you can travesty it. And that happens in every single case. It happened in Star Trek Discovery 10 ways from Sunday. And I feared the worst in Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And I got the worst. I got the worst right away. Not so much in some of the really basics. Captain Pike, for instance, is played wonderfully by Anson Mount. He is no real big screen differences from Jeffrey Hunter's portrayal of the character originally in the original show. He is, as we know in the first scene of the first episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, he is vigorously heterosexual. That's virtually forbidden in Twitter, blue checkmark politics, a takeover of popular culture. That's virtually forbidden, but he is. So the glimmer of hope that I had was, it took a lot of dings. We had a Voxer group, a bunch of people and me had a Voxer group, giving our week by week reactions to these episodes as that first season unspooled, and a lot of my initial reactions were really negative. Transporter Chief Kyle, for instance, who some of you will remember, he recurs often in the original series. He's in a few of the movies. He is named. He is played both on the original series on TV and then decades later in the movies by the same actor. We don't ever learn anything about him, but he is a steady, familiar presence. And there is a Transporter Chief Kyle in Strange New Worlds, and he isn't the same character. He's a 12-year-old gay twink. So it's not just that he's a 12-year-old gay twink, but he's going to grow into a stodgy middle-aged transporter chief. He's a different character with the same name. The same thing is true with Mr. Spock. It's played by Ethan Peck. I think, does a very good job, but he is forever bickering with his Vulcan betrothed T'Pring, and also kissing her. Vulcans don't kiss. They don't. They're an alien species. It was a big deal. DC Fontana and Leonard Nimoy made a point of saying to Gene Roddenberry's showrunners and to the writers of particular episodes, this is an alien species. We're not going to have them kiss. We're going to show that they're not exactly the same as humans. That is established canon lore. I might add that it's probably established canon lore that Spock and T'Pring did not meet before Amok Time, the original series Amok Time. I think it's pretty heavily implied in that episode that they have not met since they were children. It's not explicitly stated, though, so you can get away with it. But the chief medical officer on board the Enterprise is not Dr. Boyce, because Dr. Boyce is an old white guy. So the chief medical officer is not just somebody else, though. He's Dr. M'Benga. Now, he's wonderfully portrayed. He's wonderfully written in the show. But where's Dr. Boyce? Why would you remove him except for racist reasons? And by adding Dr. M'Benga as chief medical officer of Pike's Enterprise, you create the mother of all problems. Not the mother of all problems, we're getting to that actually, but you create a huge problem because Dr. M'Benga is part of Dr. McCoy's staff in the original series. We meet him in one episode. We are told he studied Vulcan anatomy and Vulcan physiology on Vulcan. He is an expert on Vulcan anatomy and is able to save Mr. Spock's life in one particular episode. He's, again, in that original series, he's wonderfully acted. He doesn't appear anywhere else. He's just in that one show. But he's a member of Dr. McCoy's staff. He's not the chief medical officer of Jim Kirk's Enterprise. So how does that work? How does that work? I imagine the showrunners on Strange New Worlds will come up with a reason, but I think I know what that explanation will be, and I don't like it. It wouldn't be true that the former chief medical officer would stay on as a hired hand when a new chief medical officer comes along. That wouldn't be true. That wouldn't happen. He would go for an equivalent or greater posting somewhere else. That's not how it works. We meet, we learn a lot more about number one. Who's here portrayed fantastically by Rebecca Romijn. It's just an amazing performance. Actually, almost all of the performances in Star Trek Strange New Worlds are great. And that wins you over, as I'll get to. We meet her, and it's unavoidable that we're going to learn more about number one. We learn her name. We learn her species, for instance, which is not human. We learn a lot about her, and it's all very, very well done. So I'm thinking, okay, well, Vulcans don't kiss. And M'Benga wouldn't be chief medical officer on board the Enterprise. And Transporter Chief Kyle is not a 12-year-old gay twink. But it's nice to learn more about number one. It's nice for it to be canon. Keep in mind, all the stuff we're seeing is canon here, right? If it's on the screen, big or small, it's canon. But helping Dr. M'Benga is Christine Chapel. Christine Chapel is not part of Starfleet. She's not part of an advisory to Starfleet. She's not connected with Starfleet in any way. We know her origin story. It is also in the original series. Also on board the Enterprise, serving and swapping quips and getting to know people is Jim Kirk's brother. Not Jim Kirk, but his brother, who he calls Sam, and who's called Sam by everybody in this episode, even though one of the only things we're told about him, in the one and only episode where he appears, one of the only things we're told about him, it is that, well, actually, he appears in one episode, but he's referred to in another, the episode, actually, where Christine Chapel is introduced. And in that episode, we are told explicitly one of the only things we know about Kirk's brother, which is that Jim Kirk is the only one who calls him Sam. And you would not revive this character unless you knew that. I'm not talking about digging through lore. That's the only thing we know. So the showrunners that dug this character up would have to know that. They just don't care. They just don't care. And so on and so forth. You're watching this show. I was watching the show and I was thinking, boy, oh boy, this is well done. There's genuine chemistry between most of the actors. The actress who plays Christine Chapel is awful, and she's constantly smirking and constantly self-validating, constantly telling people how wonderful she is, how amazing she is, how she understands everything better than anybody. And every once in a while, despite the fact that she's all-knowing, that she's omniscient, she'll sort of goof up, because no matter what, she's got to be a member of Nerdfighteria, right? So occasionally she will forget to be awesome. And suddenly it's, Hank Green down in sickbay. She's rather insufferable, and there's also a smirk on the bridge, a character who is wildly popular with Strange New World fans. So I'm hoping that the smirk gets toned down, and that character is wonderful. There is a bit of self-validating. The only reason that I winced with forced self-validation coming from characters, where characters themselves say how great they are. They don't wait for you, the fan, to think it. And they don't wait for anybody in the cast to say it or to say, well done. They just do it themselves. The chief engineer is an Andorian. He also constantly refers to how brilliant he is. The only reason that I wince with that is because that is the sum and essence of Star Trek Discovery. That is the sum and essence of, for instance, modern-day Marvel Comics. That is how you know that your intellectual property has been infested and entirely taken over, Borg style, by Twitter blue checkmark activists. Because that's one of the things they do. Constantly, that's one of the things they do. So when I saw that, I winced and thought, okay, well, you know what's coming then. But week after week, episode after episode, that didn't come. That didn't happen. I was ready. I had knives out. My Voxer mates can say I was as disillusioned as you could be. And week by week, the worst did not happen. Week by week, there were terrific episodes. And it is beautiful. I don't know how to stress this if you haven't seen the show, or even a clip from it. But it is the most beautiful version of Star Trek that has ever been made. It is the exact opposite of, for instance, Star Trek Discovery. But good Lord. And I'm not talking about the big special effects or the green screens or whatever. I'm talking about just the photography, the lines, the sets. It's just unbelievably crisp and beautiful. But it's also huge and state of the art. It's the Enterprise is gorgeous. It's never looked better than on this show, but it is in no way whatsoever even conceivable that this Enterprise is 10 years before Kirk's Enterprise. It's not conceivable at all, any more than it was in Star Trek Discovery, which had holograms here and holograms there, when none of that was true on Kirk's Enterprise. How on earth do you justify that? How do you square that? I kept thinking that as Strange New Worlds episodes came and went, and I kept finishing saying, well, I really enjoyed that. That was really, really good. Tremendously charismatic performances. In any Star Trek show, you are waiting to see where the personal chemistry will really take off. Where will that chemistry really take off? You won't find it in Star Trek Discovery. You can't have chemistry unless you have two different elements. In Star Trek Discovery, there was only one. There was Michael Burnham. That's it. That's all. The only element on the periodic table. But if you look back at, for instance, those older Roddenberry shows, famously, the mold from which all the others came was the chemistry between Spock, Kirk, and McCoy in the original show. And then you have others. Right? In the Next Generation, there is the particular chemistry that emerges whenever Data is involved with another member of the crew. And also chemistry between Riker and Troy. In Deep Space Nine, the chemistry is not Starfleet. It's between Quark, the Ferengi barkeep, and Odo, the shape-shifting station security chief. That's an amazing thing. You wait for that to happen. Later on in the show, there's equally unpredictable but very real chemistry between the Doctor, Dr. Bashir, and Garak, a Cardassian tailor on board the ship. You wait to see that. You wait to see what the chemistry will be like. And you can't force it. It can be in the script, but if it's not there with the actors, there's no way to make it happen. And it's there. In Strange New Worlds, the chemistry between Spock, number one, and Pike is amazing. It's really good. I hope that the showrunners lean into it. I don't think it was given as much as it could have. As much attention, as much development in the show. But while I was watching it and while I was enjoying it, I was also counting up all of the problems. With the Gorn, for instance, who are introduced, and everybody knows all about them, when no one knows all about them. Kirk meets the Gorn for the first time in the original series, when one of the people on board the Enterprise, Pike's Enterprise, is Lon Noonien Singh, who's a relative of Khan Noonien Singh, played by Ricardo Montalban in Space Seed in the original show, who the original crew of the Enterprise wake him from suspended animation, and before that no one knew he was even alive. He'd been gone for a long time, centuries. No one knew he was alive in Pike's Enterprise. They practically have trading cards of him. He's a household word. Everybody knows him. They don't need to even consult the library computers. Everybody knows about him. That doesn't square. That doesn't work in any way. And that doesn't work in a very different way from all of the sort of bottle-in continuities that happen in Star Trek Discovery, which you can largely sweep away by shunting the ship, 1,000 years in the future and never talking about it again. Then you can maybe get away with that, although it doesn't help the fact that Mr. Spock did not have a smarter, better, stronger, happier older sister. That is, I know that it happened, so it is continuity, but it's ridiculous. These are a different kind of continuity break because there's no way to sweep them away. They're sort of what you might call institutional. And they accumulated. They steadily accumulate throughout the show. I told my Voxer mates, it's the actress that they get to play Spock's betrothed to Pring is really good. And some of the stuff that goes on between them is interesting. The writing is on point here. It's not lazy or bloated the way it can be, even Star Trek Picard. It's on point almost always. But as I told my Voxer mates, it's inconceivable that this show will go to 7 seasons. I believe that this show will. Unlike other Star Trek shows that are so god-awful and so depressing and so annoying that fans hate it, I think Star Trek Strange New Worlds would actually do well in the ratings. It hits all the right buttons. It pleases. It's pleasing to watch. That's not a sin. But when I was telling my Voxer mates, if this thing goes to 7 seasons, given what we've seen so far, it's utterly impossible that they won't have Spock go through Pon farr. We know, as part of settled canon, that he does not go through Pon farr until Amok time. He says in that episode, I hoped I would be spared this. That means it's never happened to him before. There's no chance that that won't happen in Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which is a fundamental break with continuity. Now, one of the sort of floating things that really adds depth to the show, it has a lot of depth. Even the Lon Nunian Singh, I fundamentally object to the existence of the character, but the actress completely sells it. So I don't want anything to happen to her, oddly enough. I don't want anything to happen to that character, even though that character should not be there. But one of the elements floating over the show that adds depth to it is that in this show, thanks to a mystical experience that Christopher Pike has on the Klingon monastery at Borath, he knows that he's going to end up that figure in the menagerie. He knows that. He knows he's going to end up a wasted figure, totally immobilized in a chair. This is the ultimate man of action. A horseman. Someone who, that is the ultimate damnation. Far worse than death. And in this show, he knows that's coming. And he decides, do the right thing, be a hero, grab the moment anyway. Even if you know that. It's a great, absolutely great, character-defining thing. It's the first thing we get about Christopher Pike that completely separates him from all other captains. Every captain has got to have that, right? Every captain has got to have something like that. Every starship captain has to have something, some personal element that prevents them from being interchangeable with all the other starship captains that we meet. For me, at least at the beginning, that is Christopher Pike, is that he is a doomed figure and he knows it. That's incredibly heroic. But is it going to stay true? The more I watch that first episode, especially when we get introduced to a creaky 45-year-old who's Jim Kirk, but a humorless Jim Kirk, a personality-free Jim Kirk, a petty, rule-book-following, small-minded middle manager Jim Kirk. No charisma. None at all. No sense that this is the youngest person ever to command a starship to that point. No sense of anything like that. This is a Kirk that you are free to dislike. I don't think that's an accident. The incredibly incidental, downplayed nature of his first meeting with Mr. Spock, I don't believe that's an accident. I think I know what these showrunners are going to do. I think that Christopher Pike is going to find a way to avoid his destiny. And we're just never going to get Kirk's Enterprise. It's just going to be wiped out of continuity. We'll just move on from there. If Star Trek Strange New Worlds is really popular, if it's even more popular in the second season than it is in the first season, I believe that the talks that have happened at Paramount already will move forward. And that is a new Star Trek Enterprise show under Kirk. With a new Kirk, a new cast, and just redo all of it so that Star Trek, the original series, is cast off into the void. I hope that that's not true. That I'm really hoping that we never get a remake of the original series Star Trek live action on TV, even though once upon a time I would have wanted nothing else. It was my foremost dream, and the foremost dream of thousands of Star Trek fans was to get exactly that, but not when the whole goal is going to be, my usual refrain, your grandparents were horrible people. Not when the whole goal is to say Roddenberry's world is wrong. That beautiful shared sunlit universe that we talked about in August, the idea of Alex Kurtzman and Akiva Goldsman is that everything about that vision of Star Trek is wrong. It doesn't align with their current moral stances and posturing on Twitter right now in current year, so it's wrong. And it can't be allowed to stand as canon. So if they remade it, it would be radically different. Much worse. I am worried about that. I'm hoping that Star Trek Strange New Worlds' popularity does not give rise to that. That would be great if that didn't happen. But, in a way, it already has. Even if we don't get that revamped show, there is no way that Kirk's universe could flow from Pike's universe in Strange New Worlds. There's no way that that could happen. And there's no way to say that it's any kind of alternate reality because we've met Jim Kirk in this reality. So I don't know what's going to happen. At some point, the show just won for me. It just broke me. That sounds really negative. It won over. It won me over, even despite these things. My poor Voxer mates had to go through this psycho history with me. But at some point, I just realized I love this show. I am eagerly awaiting each new episode. I'm sorry that the first season ended. I'm eagerly awaiting the next season. And, the original Star Trek exists. I watched it. I've watched, thanks to Mark Richardson up in the old house in Vermont, I've watched the revamped episodes with the new special effects added in. I've watched all that. I've read all the novels. I've loved it. I've watched all the movies. No one at Paramount can take that away. That's all real, and I love that. Now, they don't make novels about it anymore. They don't hallow it in continuity. They break the continuity. They redo it. Well, fine, but that's not going anywhere. I have that to enjoy. And for one of the first times in the entire stretch of New Trek, I now have New Trek to enjoy as well. And I just won't worry about the continuity. Seems an odd thing for a Star Trek fan to say, but I just won't do it. And like I've mentioned in a couple of Book Trek episodes that I've done, videos that I've done, there are no Strange New Worlds books yet. I believe that a dozen of them could have turned out by now. It wasn't more than 3 episodes of Strange New Worlds before Paramount knew that they had at least a relative hit on their hands. Fans were loving the show, whereas, despite their best efforts to hide the fact and lie about it, fans were not loving Star Trek Discovery. They were not loving it. They hated it. And a lot of them hated Picard, especially the darker it got. And also violence to continuity. In Star Trek Picard, plenty of violence to continuity. 7 of 9 is not lesbian. She isn't. We have 5 seasons, 5 years of her being very vigorously heterosexual. You don't get to do that. Those are other writers, same as you. You are a writer. You are a showrunner for Star Trek. Other writers and other showrunners created this character and made her what she was when she became popular. The only reason you brought her back is because she was popular. Well, you don't get to have the one without the other. If you are going to cash in on her popularity, you are going to respect that popularity, except that doesn't happen at all in any franchise. That doesn't happen. And so on and so forth. There are a number of things of things like that in Star Trek Picard. I still think Star Trek Picard had some remarkable moments. I am dreading the next season, but it could work out. You never know. But at long last, with Star Trek Strange New Worlds, I have a new Trek that I can at least like. This is really, really well done. It's really well written. It's wonderfully acted, with only a tiny handful of exceptions. It can be touching. It can be moving. It gives you those moments. It's confident enough to pause and give you little moments like that. That's terrific. One of the best little moments like that is the death of the Andorian chief engineer. Has a really good moment. It's well done. It's well filmed. And it obviously paves the way for a new chief engineer, which could be Montgomery Scott. I will definitely tune in to the next season of Strange New Worlds, even though I think I know what it's trying to do. When you're dealing with blue checkmark, when you're dealing with culture war appropriations of any fan favorite franchise, there is always a political agenda. It's not possible to avoid it. It's always there, no matter what. Hollywood is now completely infested with Twitter political agendas. There's no, except for rare little islands of sanity, they are everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. So that when you watch a trailer for a movie, Vesper, you watch a trailer for a big budget science fiction movie called Vesper, and you're watching it and you're thinking, boy, those visuals are great. Something's bothering me about this trailer, though I can't quite put my finger on what it is. What's bothering me about this? It's only a trailer. It could be resolved in the movie, but why is this bothering me? And then, of course, you finish the trailer and you realize what it is, which is that that Vesper doesn't have a gender. And that is the whole point of the movie. $215 million in special effects. Another $200 million in marketing. All for that. That was the whole point. Not the writing. Not the directing. Not anything. Just that. Let's put this in front of all those bigots out there. Same thing as the main character in Terminator Dark Fate. The whole point of that movie was not a guest appearance by Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was not bringing back any old favorites. It was not destroying or prolonging the continuity. It was putting that character in front of viewers, all of whom you hate. You are assuming they are bigots, and you're doing this to fan bait them. Uh, I have to assume that Star Trek Strange New Worlds is not some weird exception. I have to assume that it was born and executed of the same kind of political agenda, and that political agenda is just being hidden, three-card Monty style. So maybe season 2 will show it to me, and then I'll know, and I can just dismiss the thing. But so far, I'm a fan. And so far, there's nothing for me to talk about on Strange New Worlds, our event, Straight Booktube, because there are no novels. And I have a feeling that probably the reason for that is because the writers are incredibly hampered by what they can and cannot produce. Which was true in the old time as well. If you, for instance, for Book Trek, thinking about Strange New Worlds, I automatically went back to all of the Star Trek novels in the last 50 years that have starred Christopher Pike. There haven't been many of them, a dozen. And they have equally been limited, because this is not the Star Wars expanded universe. You can't make stuff up, so to speak, about Christopher Pike. You can give him adventures, but you can't really fundamentally add much to him. At least you couldn't back then. That still leaves you plenty of leeway to have great adventures. There are the bare bones, but definitely the present bones, of a very interesting cast for Pike. And like I mentioned, it's a broad, blank slate. We don't know anything about his adventures. So I went back for today to one of those. I went back to this. This is a battered old copy of The Captain's Table. This was a 6-part series of books that threaded their way through all of the Star Trek continuity that existed in the Roddenberry era. This is a big anthology of all of those individual novels with my Star Trek bookmark. And the conceit behind this is that there is a restaurant, a crowded restaurant called The Captain's Table, where only captains are admitted. They're the only ones who can even see the place, much less enter. And it's all captains. It's kind of quasi-mystical in a very enjoyable way. It's kind of quasi-mystical. It's anyone who's ever had the rank of captain. They are all welcome at the captain's table, and it sort of appears anywhere that they happen to be wandering, including in the Delta Quadrant. Captain Janeway is able to go to the captain's table. She's able to find it and go, and the whole point is that each captain, when they go, they get their price of admission is to tell a story, tell one of their adventures. And there were 6 novels where captains do that. There's Captain Kirk and Captain Sulu. There's Captain Picard, Captain Sisko, Captain Janeway. Those are all on the front there because they are big ticket canonical figures. But on the back, we get the other 2 captains. Captain Calhoun from Peter David's wholly sui generis Star Trek stories and novels that he did, and Captain Pike. That's Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Christopher Pike. And the Pike episode here is Where Sea Meets Sky. It's by Jerry Olton. And it tells the story of... I guess Captain Pike should be visible, right, if I'm talking about him. It tells the story of Pike's Enterprise encountering an alien trade that is going on with an alien species of spacefaring living organisms that are as big as starships and that are being hunted, traded, enslaved, and what does Pike do about that? Now, Olton works in a subplot there, and it's a very good subplot. It's a taut story. Virtually every story in the Captain's Table series is terrific. The Janeway series is very noticeably the best of them all. It's just unbelievably good. We'll talk about it. I'm sure I've talked about it before, but the Pike story is still really good. Those of you who hear that plot description and are of a certain age and are comic book fans are automatically going to think back to the X-Men from 40 years ago, where there was a giant spacefaring species of alien being that could thrive in open space and were harvested and hunted and enslaved. And any of you back then, 40 years ago, who encountered that story for the first time, will remember the science fiction story that ripped off. Science fiction has a long history of ripping off great ideas. And that is the sort of the spine of Pike's story. He is just wandering on the Embarcadero and encounters the captain's table, goes in and is able to tell a story for the price of his admission. So going back to a Pike fiction, this was perfectly enjoyable. It's Pike, it's Dr. Boyce, it's Lieutenant Spock, it's Number One, And there are little hints and pieces, little details of all of that have been since invalidated by the show. Still very enjoyable to do. Everybody who writes a Pike story in the olden days, 40 years ago, had a whack at who number one is, what number one is, and also where Mr. Spock is in his personal development on the show, and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. In the old fan fiction days of Star Trek, long before there were novels, the number one theory about number one was that she was a Vulcan, and that's why we never see her ears, that she's half human, half Vulcan, and that's why she doesn't have the upswept eyebrows, but she does have the ears, and she hides them. And that's why she seems cold and emotionless, but very strong. That turns out not to be true. She has a much more complicated story in Star Trek Strange New Worlds. But it was also a delight to revisit this volume. I've talked about this particular volume before on this channel. Once upon a time, there's a Goodwill here in Boston. It's a sort of a charity shop that was right next to a place where I used to spend a lot of time. So I used to go to this Goodwill. And after a while, I realized that there was a warehouse annex next door that was not, the Goodwill, has stuff on shelves all set apart by what they are, good book section. But the warehouse annex next door had all of that material unsorted and piled in canvas tubs. And you could just go in there and dig through those tubs for whatever you wanted, whether it was shoes or shirts or old tech or books. There were, at the time, 4 or 5 plastic tubs piled high with books. So you had to go over and just dig through those books, heaving huge piles aside to get all the way to the bottom to find things, and just make a pile off to one side of the stuff that you were going to get. I did that for a year. I went regularly there. They were $5 for $1, regardless of the format, the size, anything of the book. So you never knew what you were going to find there. I have to assume that warehouse annex with that free-for-all of people digging and milling around with each other, I have to assume that didn't survive COVID. I confess I haven't been back in a long time. So I haven't been back to see whether or not that still happens. Maybe I should. I haven't been in that area in quite some time, in years. So I don't know if that survived COVID. I don't know if that still exists. But I found this book. I was following the Captain's Table books when they were coming out individually as paperbacks. But I found this book there and grabbed it. I didn't even know that it came out as an anthology, so I grabbed it. It was only when I got home that I realized that the previous owner was a certified loon. Because not only did this previous owner, here, let me keep my bookmark here. The previous owner redacts all of the cuss words. Just straight up redacts them. Let me find an example here. You can spot them going by as we go. Anything that this person thought was, here we go, you just missed one. Anything that this person thought was inappropriate language, they blacked out. They just blocked it out. Let me see if we can, let me get you an example here. You've seen some of them. It doesn't happen often. Some of the stories worse than others. Yeah, here we go. Very neatly redacted text for anything where the characters are cussing or anything like that. All throughout, all of the books in here, very carefully done. And in addition to that, this person, the person who had this book before me, wanted only canonical Star Trek. And of course, Captain Calhoun, Peter David's Captain Calhoun, is not canonical Star Trek. Never appeared on a screen, big or small. Just Peter David invented it for the books. And the person who had this book before me decided, in addition to expurgating it so there were no cuss words, they decided that they didn't want to read that story. And they didn't want anybody else to read it either. So they excised it from the book. It is simply missing from the book. They cut it out. It's just gone. They cut the whole thing out, page by page. And the cuts are uniform. They had to use a straight edge. I'm amazed that a person this insane would be allowed near straight edges. So I love going back to this book, no matter what. It always brings a smile to my face. And I found it at that Goodwill annex. But anyway, that is your Strange New Worlds for today. It is, what was it called again? Where Sea Meets Sky by Jerry Olton, a Christopher Pike novel from before there was a Strange New Worlds show. I promise that tomorrow's book trek video will be shorter. I promise. I went on about the show. Now I've said my piece there, so tomorrow we'll be able to do it in much more expeditiously. So I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.